What I was not ready for was the other part of the training. The part where they teach you to look at people as variables, threats, assets, neutrals. The part where you learn to walk into a room and immediately calculate every exit and every person between you and those exits. The part where you stop seeing the world the way a normal person sees it and start seeing it the way a machine sees it. I was very good at that part. That surprised me more than anything. My first assignments were low-level, escort jobs, watching a door, running patrol routes around facilities that I was never told the full purpose of. I did the work. I did it quietly. I did it well. Director Voss moved me up faster than anyone expected. Within 8 months, I was handling mid-level assignments. Within a year, I was assigned to personal protection detail. That was when I saw Sarah again. She was in the lobby of a hotel where I was running a protection detail for a client I cannot name. She was with a group, laughing at something someone had said, completely at ease in a world of marble floors and expensive suits. For a second, I just watched her. She looked different from the alley. Not just dressed differently, something in the way she carried herself. Like the version of her in the alley had been a shadow, and this was the real thing. Then she turned and saw me. For a second, neither of us moved. Then she smiled. And this time the smile reached her eyes. She found me on a break, and we talked for about 15 minutes. She asked how the job was going. I told her it was going well. She said she was glad. I asked her about herself, and she got a little vague, which I noticed, and filed away, which I was now trained to do. She said her family had many interests. She said she traveled a lot. She said she would like to have coffee sometime, if I was ever free. I said sure. Again. Because I was still bad at words when I was nervous around her. But we did have coffee. A week later. Then again 2 weeks after that. Then it became a regular thing, and neither of us acknowledged that it had become a regular thing, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. I want to be honest about what was happening. I was falling for her. Completely, and in exactly the way a person with no experience falling for someone does it, which is to say, totally without defenses and way too fast. She was sharp and warm and funny in a dry, quiet way that you had to be paying attention to catch. She remembered everything I told her. She asked questions that made it clear she had been thinking about our last conversation in between seeing me. She looked at me like I was worth looking at. I had never had that before. Not once. What I did not know then, what I had no way of knowing yet, was that Sarah's family was one of the most powerful criminal dynasties in the country. Not mobsters in the loud, cinematic way. Worse, the quiet kind. The kind that owns buildings and politicians and people like Director Voss. The kind whose name never appears in news stories, but whose fingerprints are on everything that goes wrong in them. And the reason she had been in that alley that night was not coincidence. She had been running from someone who worked for a rival family. Someone who had been sent to deliver a message. The 3 men were not random thieves. They were professionals who had pulled back the moment I intervened, because involving a civilian would have created complications. I was not a hero in that alley. I was an accidental variable that ruined a carefully planned operation. I did not know any of this yet. Here is what I knew. I was good at my job. I was getting better every week. Director Voss trusted me with more than he trusted most people who had been there longer. And every few weeks, I met Sarah for coffee and went home feeling like something in my chest had been turned on that I did not know was ever off. Then the mission changed everything. Director Voss called me into his office one morning and told me I was being assigned to a new protection detail. Ongoing. High priority. The client required someone with my specific profile, meaning young, unremarkable in appearance, capable of blending into non-corporate environments. The work would involve close proximity, extended hours, possible relocation. He slid a file across the desk. I opened it. The photo inside was Sarah. I should have said something right then. I should have disclosed the connection. Every protocol I had been trained on said you declare a conflict of interest before an assignment, not during it, not after. You say it immediately. You let someone else take the job. I did not say anything. I told myself it was because the job was important. I told myself I could handle it professionally. I told myself that knowing her was actually an asset, that she would trust me faster, that the protection would be more effective. I was lying to myself. I just did not know it yet. The assignment began formally 3 days later. I met Sarah in the lobby of her family's primary residence, a building so grand it felt less like a home and more like a declaration. She saw me, and for a moment something flashed across her face that I could not read. Then it was gone, replaced by the composure she wore like a second skin, and she shook my hand formally and welcomed me to the detail. We did not talk about coffee. The detail was different from anything I had done before. Her life was enormous. Events and meetings and travel and 1,000 moving pieces, all requiring coordination and vigilance. Her family's enemies were real and specific, and I started learning their names and methods very quickly. I learned that the men in the alley that night were from a group called the Meridian Circle. I learned that they had been targeting Sarah for over a year. I learned that 2 previous operatives assigned to protect her had been compromised. One had taken a bribe, one had disappeared. This information was delivered to me very casually by my second in the detail, a woman named Croft who had been in the firm for 11 years and had the eyes of someone who had seen every way a thing can go wrong. She told me this not as a warning. She told me this as briefing, as if she was reading from a manual, as if the disappearance of a colleague was just data. I started to understand what kind of world I was actually in, and I started to change. It is hard to explain how it happens. It does not happen all at once. It is more like the water getting colder, a degree at a time, until you look down and realize your hands have gone numb, and you cannot remember when you last felt them. The training reshapes you. The work reshapes you. The constant calculation, the constant threat assessment, the constant positioning of yourself between danger and the person you are protecting. It takes something from you. Some warmth, some softness, some version of yourself that used to feel things the normal way. I became very good at the job, and I became harder. Sarah noticed. She did not say anything at first, but I caught her watching me sometimes with an expression I could not name. Not fear, not distance. Something more like sadness, which made no sense because I was doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing. The first real test came 4 months into the detail. We were at a gala event. Sarah was representing her family at some charitable function that was less about charity and more about visibility. The room was full of people from every stratum of the city's power structure. I was running the perimeter rotation with 2 other operatives when I got a signal from the door team. 2 individuals had entered on forged credentials. I had 3 seconds to decide. I made the call. I crossed the room in under a minute, reached Sarah, and had her out a side exit before she had fully processed what was happening. My backup contained the 2 individuals at the door. Neither of them was armed. They were journalists. Aggressive ones, but journalists. No threat. False alarm. Except in those 3 seconds before I knew that, I had made the calculation instantly. Remove the asset. Neutralize the exposure vector. Get her out. Not her, the asset. That was the word that had come into my head. I stood in the back corridor watching my backup handle the situation, and I noticed what had changed. A year ago, I had moved toward that alley because a person was in danger, and my body had moved before my mind could stop it. Now I had moved because a calculation was complete, and the result indicated action. The outcome was the same. The machinery behind it was different. Sarah looked at me in the corridor and said, "Are you okay?" Which was not a question I expected her to ask in that moment. I was the protection. I was supposed to be asking her that, but she was looking at me with those dark, sharp eyes and asking me if I was okay. I said yes. She held eye contact for one more second and then nodded, and we went back inside. After that night, she started asking me things. Small things at first. Where I grew up, what I did before the firm, whether I had people. I answered in short sentences because short sentences revealed less, and revealing less was now just how I operated. She pushed a little. Not hard. She was too smart to push hard. She just kept asking. Week after week, small questions. I started answering a little more each time. It was the closest thing to the coffee conversations that we allowed ourselves in the formal structure of the detail. And I think we both knew it was dangerous. Not in the way the Meridian Circle was dangerous, in a different way, a more personal way. The kind of danger that does not come at you with weapons, the kind that comes at you quietly, through small conversations and shared silences, and the way someone looks at you when they think you are not looking back. I was always looking back. The threat level escalated in the 7th month. The Meridian Circle made a direct move, not subtle, not strategic, a direct, forceful attempt to remove Sarah from circulation. I will not go into specifics because some of it is still classified in ways that matter, but I will say that 3 of their operatives got further than any threat had gotten before, and I handled all 3. And when it was over, Sarah was safe, and I was standing in a hallway covered in evidence of exactly how much I had just been willing to do to make sure she stayed that way. She saw me after. She did not look frightened. She looked at me with something that was even harder to read than usual. And then she walked toward me instead of away, and she put her hand on my arm, and she said my name. Just my name. Kane. And somehow the way she said it, like she was checking that I was still in there, undid something I had been very carefully holding together. I said I was fine. She said, "I know." Then she said, "But are you still you?" I did not have an answer for that. That question lived in me for weeks. Are you still you? It was a question I would have understood immediately a year and a half ago. A year and a half ago, the answer would have been obvious, even if the me in question was not particularly impressive or interesting. Just a warehouse worker with bad shoes. But real. Fully accounted for. Now I ran threat matrices in social situations. I categorized people by risk level before I knew their names. I had not felt afraid in months, which sounds like a good thing until you understand that fear is also information. Fear is your body telling you, this matters. And I had stopped receiving that signal. I was very effective. I was also disappearing. Director Voss noticed the disappearance differently. He saw it as evolution. He told me I was exactly what the firm produced at its best. Precise, decisive, loyal to the mission. He started talking about a senior position, a team of my own. A different level of operation where my profile would be an asset in ways my current assignment could not fully utilize. I should have wanted that. 6 months earlier, I would have wanted that desperately. I nodded and said I was grateful for the confidence, and I would give it full consideration. And I meant all of that. But I also went back to my quarters that night and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a long time, doing nothing. Which was new. I almost never did nothing anymore. Doing nothing was inefficient. Doing nothing was not protocol. But I sat there in the dark, and I thought about the alley. The original one. The first night. The way my feet had moved before I had decided to move them. The way there had been no calculation, just reaction. Just one human moving toward another human in trouble, because that was what a person did. I thought about that for a long time. The situation broke open 3 weeks later. Croft came to me with intelligence that changed everything. There was a leak inside the detail. Someone had been feeding information to the Meridian Circle. The compromised operative model was repeating itself. And based on communication patterns and access logs and a dozen other pieces of data that Croft laid out with her usual flat efficiency, the most probable source was someone in Sarah's inner circle. Not staff, not peripheral. Inner circle. Family. The name that came up in the data was Sarah's cousin, a man named Dorian, who had been positioned as her closest family confidant for the past 2 years. Charming, present, trusted, and according to everything Croft had assembled, actively working against her. I took the intelligence to Director Voss. He read it. He thought for a moment. And then he said something that cracked something inside me cleanly in half. He said, "This changes the asset's profile significantly." Not her, not Sarah, the asset. He said a family betrayal at this level would destabilize her position within the organization. He said destabilized positions created opportunities. He said there were parties who would pay considerably for intelligence about internal fragmentation in the family structure. He said none of this was outside our standard operating parameters. I sat very still, and I said, "Are we talking about using this to protect her or to leverage her?" There was a pause. He said, "Those two things were not mutually exclusive in our line of work." And there it was. The reason 2 previous operatives had disappeared was not because the Meridian Circle got to them. It was because they had found out exactly what I had just found out. That the firm's relationship with Sarah's family was not protection. It was management. And at a certain level of operation, there was no difference between protecting an asset and owning one. I stood up and I said I needed the night to process the intelligence and determine the best operational approach. He believed me. Or he pretended to. I could not tell anymore. I went directly to Sarah. I told her everything. The leak, Dorian, the firm, what Voss had said, all of it. I sat across from her in her private office and I told her the truth, without any of the professional framing, without the asset language, without the calculation. Just the facts, told by one person to another person who deserved to know them. She listened without interrupting. Her face did not change much, but her hands, which were folded on the desk, went very still. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know about the firm. I've known for a while." I said, "Then why keep the detail?" She said, "Because of you." That was not something I was prepared for. Even with all the training in the world, even with every soft thing in me recalibrated into a sensor array, that sentence hit me somewhere that had apparently not been fully converted. She said she had watched me change over the past year. She had watched the person from the alley go further and further away. And she said she had kept asking small questions and having coffee conversations because she was trying to find out if he was still in there. The person who had moved before he thought about it. The person who had helped someone he did not know for no reason except that it was the right thing to do. She said she had been worried she had lost him. I said I was not sure she was wrong to be worried. She stood up and she came around the desk and she looked at me the way she had looked at me in that alley when I had first helped her up. Like I was something she had not expected. Like the calculation she had been running had returned a result that surprised her. She said, "I think he is still in there. I think you are still in there." I said, "I do not feel like it most of the time." She said, "I know. But you came here tonight. You could have gone to Voss with the intelligence and played it his way. You came here instead." And she was right. I had not thought about it that way. But the moment I had finished reading Croft's report, the moment I had understood what Voss was suggesting, my feet had already been pointing toward her door. No calculation, just direction. The same way they had pointed toward that alley 2 years ago. Maybe something in me had not been converted, after all. What came next moved fast. Sarah had resources and connections that I had not fully accounted for, because my assessment of her had been filtered through the firm's framing. The firm saw her as an asset to be managed. The actual reality of who she was, what she had built, what she was capable of, that was a different picture entirely. Within 48 hours, she had moved against Dorian through channels I did not know existed. Within 72 hours, she had documentation that would be significantly damaging to Director Voss and several parties he worked with if it became public. She was not a victim. She had never been a victim. She had been playing a very long game that I had been too deep inside the machine to see clearly. Dorian was removed from her circle without drama, without public incident, with the kind of quiet efficiency that I had been trained to execute, but that she had apparently been practicing on her own terms for years. He went from inner circle to absent in a way that left no loose ends and sent a message to everyone in that world who knew what to look for. The message was, I knew, I handled it. Do not test me again. Director Voss received a package 3 days later. I do not know exactly what was in it. I know that afterward he called me and told me the assignment had changed in scope and that I should consider my position within the firm to be independent going forward. Which was the most careful possible way of saying that he could no longer leverage me or tell me what to do. That was a quiet moment for me. Standing in my apartment, holding my phone, understanding that a man who had seemed untouchable was suddenly careful around me. Not because I had beaten him at his own game, because she had. I went to Sarah that evening. I told her I was no longer operationally within the firm's structure. She said she knew. I asked what came next. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said that depended on me. She said she was going to rebuild what needed to be rebuilt in her family structure. She said there was a position in that process, not as a hired operative, not as a managed asset on someone's ledger, but as someone she actually trusted. Which, she said, was a very short list. She said she would understand if I wanted nothing to do with any of it. I thought about the warehouse, the 4 minutes of hot water, the worn-through heel on my left shoe. I thought about the alley. I thought about a year and a half of becoming something colder and more precise than the person who had run into that alley. I thought about whether that person was still recoverable. And then I said yes. Not because I had calculated it, not because the risk profile was acceptable, or the reward structure made sense, or the operational parameters were clearly defined. Because my feet were already pointing in the right direction. But here's the thing about saying yes to a world like that. A world of power structures, and family dynasties, and enemies who do not stop just because you have won a round. Saying yes is the beginning, not the end. And what comes with that yes is something that neither of us had fully reckoned with yet, because Dorian was removed. But Dorian had partners. The Meridian Circle had not been working with him out of goodwill. They had been working with him because someone had put them in touch. Someone higher than Dorian. Someone who had been watching Sarah's family for longer than any of us had been watching back. Someone for whom Dorian was just one piece in a board that was much larger than anything I had seen inside the firm's briefing files. I found out about this 3 weeks after I said yes. Croft came to me. Not through the firm this time. Personally. She sat across from me in a coffee shop, which felt almost absurd given the subject matter, and she put a drive on the table, and she said she had spent 11 years inside that machine, and she was done, and this was everything she had gathered on the actual power structure behind what we had both been working in. I asked her why she was giving it to me. She said because I was the only person she had seen leave that machine still pointed at something real. I took the drive. What was on it rewrote everything. The person at the top of the structure, the one who had pointed the Meridian Circle at Sarah, the one who had built the network of leverage and compromise that included Director Voss and a dozen others like him, was someone I had heard of. Everyone in this world had heard of him. He was known as an investor, a philanthropist, a quiet hand behind several major foundations. His name appeared on buildings. His face appeared at the right events. He was, by every public measure, one of the most respected figures in the country. And he had been trying to dismantle Sarah's family for 18 years. Not because of rivalry, not because of territory. Because 18 years ago, Sarah's father had found out something about him that could have ended everything for him, and had chosen not to use it. And the man had spent every year since making sure that mercy was punished so completely that no one would ever think to show it again. I read all of this sitting at that table, with my coffee going cold and the city moving past the window like nothing outside of normal. Then I went back to Sarah, and I told her. She read the drive, the whole thing. It took hours. I watched her face the entire time, the way the information landed in her, the way she processed it. She did not break. She did not panic. She reached the end, and she sat very still for a moment. And then she looked at me and said, "My father knew this about him." I said, "Yes." She said, "And he let him go?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" I said, "According to everything on that drive, because your father believed people could change. Because he thought destroying someone's life over what they were capable of, rather than what they had done, was not justice." She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, "He was wrong." And that was the moment. That was the moment where I watched something shift in her, the same way something had shifted in me over the past year and a half. Where I understood that we were both standing at an edge, and the question was what we were going to do when we looked down. The old me, the warehouse version, would have had no answer. He barely had opinions about anything. The machine version I had been trained into would have calculated an optimal response. But I was trying to be something else now. Something that had the precision of the machine and the realness of the warehouse worker, and was neither of them entirely. I said, "Maybe he was wrong about that specific person, but I do not think he was wrong about the idea." She looked at me. I said, "I think the question is whether we want to beat this man by becoming him, or whether we beat him some other way." She said, "Is there another way?" I said, "I do not know yet, but I am willing to find out." She looked at me for a long time, and then something happened in her eyes that I had not seen before, not even in all the months of coffee conversations and small questions in close quarters. Something that was not the composure or the sharpness or the warmth. Something underneath all of that. Something that was afraid and honest and more real than anything the version of her that moved through grand lobbies ever showed anyone. She said, "I do not want to become the thing I am fighting." I said, "Then we do not." She said, "But we have to do something." I said, "Yes, we do." And that was not a comfort. It was not a resolution. It was not a happy ending. It was the moment where we both understood exactly what we were walking into and chose to walk into it anyway. Not because the odds were good, not because we had a plan, but because sometimes you just move before you have time to calculate. Because sometimes the feet know before the head does. Because that is what people do. The drive that Croft gave us was a weapon, but weapons require strategy, and the strategy was going to require us to expose this man in a way that could not be suppressed, bought off, or quietly disappeared, the way everything in his world had been quietly disappeared for decades. It required reaching people and institutions that he had not yet fully compromised. It required building something he could not easily destroy. It also required staying alive long enough to use it, because the moment we moved, he would know. And a man who had run this kind of quiet, patient, invisible war for 18 years was not going to respond slowly. I started planning. Not the machine kind of planning. Not the cold, optimal solution calculation I had been trained into. The other kind. The kind where you accept that you do not know all the variables, and you move anyway because the alternative is to stand still in a world that is moving against you. Sarah started making contact with people she had been cultivating for years. People outside the structure. Journalists, regulators, former members of institutions who had their own grievances and their own collected evidence, and had been waiting for someone to make the first move. We were building something. It was slow. It was dangerous. And every day that we moved pieces into position was a day that the man on the other end of 18 years of patient war had to not notice what we were doing. I stopped sleeping well. Not because of the threat assessment, though the threat assessment was very real. Because of the question that would not leave me. The question Sarah had asked me months ago, and that I had still not fully answered. Are you still you? I was still trying to work out what the answer was. I was not the warehouse worker anymore. I was not the machine the firm had been building. I was something in between that I did not have a clean name for. Something that could plan and fight and be still in a hallway at 2 a.m. calculating variables, but that still moved before it thought sometimes. That still went toward things instead of away from them. That still sat in the dark sometimes just to sit in the dark. I think that was the answer. I think that was still me. And then the morning came when Sarah knocked on my door early and came in and said, "He knows." I said, "How long do we have?" She said, "Not long." I said, "Are we ready?" She looked at me, and for just a second, under all the composure and the sharpness and the preparation, I could see the girl from the alley, shaking but not crying, getting back on her feet, looking at a stranger who had moved without thinking and deciding in that moment to trust him. She said, "No." Then she said, "Let's go anyway." And we went. What came after that was the hardest and the most terrifying, and in some ways the most alive I have ever felt in my life. It was not clean. It was not a straight line from exposure to victory. It was messy and dangerous, and there were moments where I genuinely did not know if we were going to survive it. Not just physically. In every way a person can mean survive. But here is what I know. When the drive went public, it went wide. Fast, too wide to suppress. The man who had been patient and invisible for 18 years found himself suddenly, devastatingly visible. Not because we had destroyed him the way he had tried to destroy others, but because we had told the truth, loudly enough that other people who knew pieces of it started telling their truths too. One voice is easy to silence. 50 is harder. 100 becomes impossible. He had spent 18 years making himself untouchable. It turned out that touchability had less to do with power than he had always believed, and more to do with how many people you had made into enemies along the way. Sarah stood in front of cameras and told the story clearly and without flinching. I stood off to the side and watched her do it, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Something that had nothing to do with calculation. Pride. Real, uncomplicated pride. In her. In what she had chosen to be in the moment when she could have chosen to become something harder and colder and more survivable, but also less real. The aftermath was long. Legal processes, security concerns that lasted months, restructuring of things I cannot name specifically. Nights where we sat across from each other and tried to figure out what came next. At some point, those conversations stopped being about strategy. At some point, they became something else. And I could tell you about that, but some things are not for a story. Some things are just yours. The small, real things that belong to the people they happen to, and nobody else. What I can tell you is that Sarah asked me one more time, much later, in a very different context, whether I was still me. And this time, I had an answer. I said, mostly, with some additions, and some deletions. She said, which deletions? I said, the ones that were not actually me, just the machine parts, the ones that stopped feeling things as information. She said, and the additions? I said, you. She looked at me, and there was a long, quiet moment. And then she said, that was the corniest thing I had ever said in our entire acquaintance. I said, I know. I am working on it. She laughed, and it was real, fully real. The kind of laugh that sounds like something being set down, like someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, finally finding a place to put it. I thought about the alley. I thought about moving before I thought about it. I thought about where the feet know before the head does. And I thought, okay, maybe this is what that was pointed at all along. Not the fighting, not the training, not the strategy or the exposure or any of the machinery we had to build and use and dismantle. Just this, a real laugh in a quiet room. After a very long time of neither of us being sure we were going to get here. But do not think for a second that means it was over. Because 3 weeks after that quiet room, Croft came back. Not to a coffee shop this time. To my door. At 6 a.m. With an expression on her face that I had never seen before in 11 years of watching her be completely unmoved by everything. She said, there is a second drive. I said, from where? She said, from him. Left somewhere deliberate. Somewhere we would find it after he went down. I said, why would he leave a second drive? She said, because the first drive was what he wanted us to find. What he wanted to be the story. I felt something cold move through me that was not the machine cold. The real kind. She said, Kane, whatever was on that first drive, there is something worse. Something he had been keeping separate. Something that, if it is what I think it is, changes everything we thought we knew about why any of this started. I said, including Sarah's father. She did not say anything, which was its own answer. I stood in my doorway for a moment. The city was coming awake outside. The light was the gray gold color of early morning. Somewhere above me, a neighbor was stomping around, and it almost made me smile. Some things do not change. Then I stepped back and opened the door wider. I said, you better come in. This was not the end. It was not even close to the end. There are things I still do not know. Things Croft had been sitting on for reasons I have not yet fully understood. Things about Sarah's father, and a decision he made 18 years ago that looked like mercy and might have been something else entirely. Things about who built the firm and why, and what they were actually building it for. There is a second drive, and whatever is on it, someone thought it was worth leaving behind as a final move on a board that I thought had already been cleared. I should be afraid of that. I am not afraid of that. I am moving toward it. Same as always. Before I think about it.